Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Natalie, and we are so excited to have you join us today for our kickoff Florida Climate Crisis webinar series. So it is exactly 12 p.m. on the dot. We're going to give maybe just one more minute for everyone to settle in. And we will start our webinar on extreme heat. So we'll just wait about 30 more seconds and then we'll start with some introductions and get the webinar rolling. Thank you all so much for joining. All right, so let's see here. It is 12:01. We're going to go ahead and get started because we value everyone's time. And again, thank you so much for being here. My name is Natalie. I am the program manager at the CLEO Institute. I am joined by Dr. Rachel Licker from the Union of Concerned Scientists, and she's going to be showcasing some of the innovative tools that she's been working regarding extreme heat. And I'm also joined by the Director of Development, Natalia Ortiz, who is going to be sharing some new action items, as well as a campaign that we've recently launched regarding the climate crisis in Florida. We will start briefly again with introductions, and I will let everyone know that this webinar is being translated in Spanish. So if you're interested in translating in Spanish, go ahead and pueden iniciar la traducción en español haciendo clic sobre el botón de interpretación en la barra de herramientas en Zoom. También pueden chequear en el chat, ahí pueden encontrar direcciones para cómo iniciar la traducción. Como mencioné, este taller va a estar traducido en español. So just letting everyone know that we are going to be translating in Spanish, and here you have a quick picture of who your hosts are. Again, my name is Natalie, and I'm joined by Dr. Rachel Licker. Before we officially get started on the webinar, just some quick house rules. If you do have any questions, and we hope that you do, please put them in the Q&A button that you see in your Zoom toolbar. We are going to be ending this webinar with a community discussion and question and answer session. If you have any other comments, any technical issues or troubleshooting, please go ahead and drop those issues in the chat function. If you drop a question in the chat function, we won't see it. So make sure that questions go in Q&A. Any other comments or issues go in the chat function. I do have my colleague Olivia troubleshooting. Should there be any internet issues or connection issues, please bear with us. Again, we are going to be translating in Spanish. Inicie la traducción haciendo clic sobre la interpretación en la barra de herramientas del Zoom. Para escuchar en español, llame al 786-665-8802. And let's go ahead and get started. So the CLEO Institute, just a quick introduction for those who may not be familiar with us. We are an education nonprofit that focuses on climate advocacy, engagement, and action. We typically take the science, impacts, and solutions of climate and break it down into digestible bits for people from all walks of life. We work with fact-based, science-based organization. So a lot of our information comes from NASA, NOAA, as you see here. And we at CLEO approach climate from a top-down and bottom-up approach. We work with people and students in the community and in schools, and we also engage with elected officials and municipalities. Before we get into the incredible work that Dr. Licker is doing at the Union of Concerned Scientists, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to the climate crisis. So I'm going to attempt to break the record for the briefest introduction to climate and make sure that everyone is on the same page. Again, one last reminder, if you'd like to listen to this en español, para escuchar en español, por favor llama 786-665-8802. All right, so the scientific consensus. Virtually 100% of the world's foremost scientists and agencies do agree, not only that climate change is happening, but that it is extremely likely due to human activities. So what kind of activities are we talking about? We're talking about industrial activities, transportation, the generation of electricity, industry, agriculture. So our global energy supply depends on carbon-rich prehistoric remains called fossil fuels to run these industries. When we refine and burn fossil fuels to make fuel or electricity, it emits carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases that fundamentally drives climate change. And so we're gonna just talk a little bit about the cycling of carbon dioxide. What you see in this graph is that there was a natural cycling of carbon dioxide over the span of hundreds of thousands of years. So this is what we call normal and natural climate variation, where you see that atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide went as low as 200 parts per million in the ice ages and 300 parts per million in the warmer temperatures. Today, we are at 414 parts per million. So that is a statistically significant difference that you see happen right there towards the right of the graph towards the Industrial Revolution. So what we're doing is spewing our gaseous waste into the atmosphere in a geological second. And that has a lot of implications because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, and greenhouse gases warm the earth. They absorb energy and they slow the rate at which heat escapes back into outer space. So Earth is getting warmer. This really cool graph from NASA shows the vantage point of space and helps us understand the interconnectedness of Earth. Summer months in South Florida resulted in several extreme heat advisories as the heat index rose to over 105 degrees sometimes. As of 2019, the past 5 years have been the hottest on record since we started recording weather. So I think this is a great segue to introduce the work that Dr. Licker is doing, especially when it comes to using data, science, and innovation to create these tools to help us make better decisions, not only in our personal lives, but also with engaging with stakeholders, elected officials. So when we engage with stakeholders, with elected officials, with their family, these are the kinds of things that we're going to be advocating for in the lens of extreme heat. We're going to be talking about public health today. We're going to talk a little bit about justice, but other aspects that are driven by and impacted by extreme heat include our economy, biodiversity, extreme weather, immigration, and food and water security. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and let Dr. Licker take it away. Oh, you're still muted.
Yep, thank you. Awesome. Thank you so much, Natalie, for the introduction. And I'm so happy to be here with you all today. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know we live in very unusual circumstances where sitting down for a long period of time is precious. So thank you. So I work for a nonprofit, the Union of Concerned Scientists, where we put science to action and try to help create a safer, more just future using science and helping to inform policies. So I'm going to be talking about a report that my colleagues and I at the Union of Concerned Science published last year called Killer Heat in the United States. We have actually an accompanying peer-reviewed journal article that was published with this in the journal Environmental Research Communications. Next slide, please. Great. So as you know, living in Florida, heat can be really dangerous. It can have consequences for a lot of different aspects of our life and our livelihoods. And so I just wanted to talk about the fact that in the United States, extreme heat is currently the top weather-related cause of death. This is a specific example of that. This is from the infamous Chicago heat wave in 1995. And this graph is showing you over the course of a year, the average number of deaths that occur on any given day. That's the orange line at the bottom. And in red is the number of deaths that occurred in 1995 on those same exact days. And green is the daily maximum temperature. So you can see that as temperatures climbed above 100 degrees Fahrenheit during that heat wave, there was also a spike in the number of deaths. And one of the points, there's some text at the top, and what that's saying is that the number of deaths that was recorded was different from the departure between the average number of deaths for any given day and those that occurred in 1995. And so what that's about is heat contributes to many more deaths than are actually accounted for in coroner reports. So it can, for example, exacerbate pre-existing health conditions and cause things like respiratory disease and cardiovascular disease, and thus not get noted on coroner's reports as the cause of death. So we don't even actually fully have a full grasp of how heat contributes to deaths. You can see here the difference is about 300 or so. So next slide, please. So we saw that there was a gap between the information that people had about how extreme heat is likely to change and what was out there. Projections of heat and how it's likely to change in a warming world are typically done, or historically, a lot of the science has just looked at temperature. But as you know, in Florida, humidity is a really big part of the story in terms of how we experience heat. And so we saw a need to develop projections of the heat index, or feels like temperature, which is a combination of temperature and humidity. And it's actually what the National Weather Service uses to issue heat advisory alerts. And I should just say, I see FedEx trucks circling my neighborhood, and I have a dog, and I feel like I'm, of course, going to have her start barking right in the middle of a presentation. Apologies if that happens. One thing that I wanted to note in this slide is that we did these projections for 3 different emission scenarios across the whole 21st century. We looked at an emission scenario in red that's approximately like our current emissions pathway. We call that the no action scenario. We looked at how extreme heat is likely to change if we took what we call slow action and start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions around mid-century. And we looked at a scenario in which we took bold action, that's the green line, and met the Paris Climate Agreement goal of keeping global average temperature change to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And so we developed, if you can just go back, sorry, a couple other points that I wanted to make. We developed these projections using extremely high resolution climate models. So if you can just imagine a grid being plopped down on top of the United States, each grid cell box is 2.5 by 2.5 miles wide. So we can see in that level of detail how extreme heat is likely to change again, across the 21st century and across the United States. Next slide, please. Thank you. So then what we did is we took these heat index projections and we looked at the number of days in an average year at mid-century and late century for these 3 different emission scenarios, and looked at the number of days in an average year that it would exceed a few different important thresholds. For starters, we looked at the number of days that would exceed 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And I should say we also compared that with the historical levels. And we chose 90 degrees Fahrenheit because it's particularly relevant to outdoor workers. Above that, OSHA, the Occupational and Safety Hazard Administration, says that we need to start protecting workers because they could experience adverse health effects. We also looked at the number of heat index days above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's because above that threshold, children, elderly adults, pregnant women, people with pre-existing health conditions, for example, again, the cardiovascular, respiratory disease, have a heightened risk of heat-related illness. Moving along, we looked at the number of days above 105 degrees Fahrenheit because above that, anyone can be at risk. And then we looked at the number of days above what we call off-the-charts conditions. So what are off-the-charts conditions? We can go to the next slide and I can talk about that. Off-the-charts conditions are values that are so hot that the National Weather Service heat index equation no longer works. These are temperatures that are above 127 degrees Fahrenheit. And what that would mean is that we would have days that could be so hot that it would be just dangerous to go outside. Currently in the United States, the only place that has those kinds of conditions is in a place called the Sonoran Desert, which is at the US-Mexico border. And that is those kinds of conditions, as you'll see as we move along the presentation, are likely to expand across significant swaths of the country for some period of time each year if we don't take climate action. So what that would mean, sorry, we can just go back for a moment. Again, it'd be too dangerous to have building and construction, kids playing outside, agricultural workers picking our food, our mail being delivered. Next slide, please. And so I just wanted to get on the same page about what we're talking about when we say heat-related illness. What does that really mean? And so heat-related illness is kind of an umbrella term that means that refers to things that are everywhere from very mild things like having a headache, maybe having a dry mouth, feeling a little dizzy, to more severe conditions like having heat cramps, seizures, having a stroke, even death can occur because of heat-related illness. Next slide, please. So what I'm showing you here is the results from, sorry, one moment, showing you results from our study. The maps on the left are showing you the historical number of days in which the heat index value across the United States was higher than 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's the top left map. The values range from 0 to 1 days in an average year. That's the white values or the white locations. The yellow is 1 to 10, and it gets progressively higher up to red, where that's more than, or it's between 100 to 200 such days or higher. And the bottom is those same exact values, but for 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The map on the right, these are showing you what would happen at mid-century, and that's not far off. That's in our lifetime, in a few decades, if we took no action on climate change. And you can see that these kinds of really extreme heat conditions are likely to spread across significant swaths of the country. And if you look at Florida, you can see that it just lights up. We go from a situation in which it's already hot and it gets much, much hotter. Next slide, thanks. these maps are showing you what would happen at the end of the century if we took no action on climate change. Again, looking at these 105-degree Fahrenheit days. And then on the bottom is showing how many places would have off the charts days at least some point in the year. You can see that Florida, by and large, if we took no action on climate change, could have on the order of magnitude of 2 to 3 weeks per year with those kinds of dangerous conditions, underscoring the imperative of taking climate action. Next slide, please. Now, we also looked at things at the city level. What this map is showing you is the places that the ones with the red circles and the white in the center, so just a few, California, Nevada. These are cities that have had historically 30 days or more in an average year in which the heat index value was greater than 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And at mid-century, if we took no action on climate change, the places with red dots are cities that would then have those kinds of conditions. Again, 30 or more days per year with a heat index above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. So a really big difference in the expansion of extreme heat. Next slide, please. What you see here are two maps showing the difference between if we took no action and if we took really serious, bold action and met the Paris Climate Agreement temperature goals. On the left, you see late century, what would happen if we did not take action. And again, the number of cities that would have a month's worth or more of days with a heat index above 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And on the right, you see what it could be like if we actually met the Paris Climate Agreement goals. A huge number, millions of Americans would, and US residents would be spared those kinds of conditions. Next slide, please. And I would like to underscore a really, really important point here that this has serious equity and justice implications. My colleague, Adrienne Hollis, did an analysis in which she looked at the killer heat reports by race and ethnic groups. She found here, she looked at the number of days in an average year for counties in which 25% or more of the population was self-identified as African American, and counties that had less than that value. And historically, she found that there was basically no difference between the number of days with these kinds of extreme heat conditions. But at mid-century, the number of days in an average year with 105 degree or more heat index values would double. There would be twice as many, I should say, in the counties with 25% or more African Americans. So when you couple that with the fact that obviously minority, low income, communities of color have had disproportionate access to quality healthcare, disproportionately lower, I should say, and other sorts of inequalities that stem from systemic racism, that is going to, when coupled with these kinds of extreme heat projections, create huge unequal risks. Next slide, please. So I wanted to walk you through the slides or some of the resources that we developed at the Union of Concerned Scientists to make these results accessible to the public. So for starters, we developed this interactive map of the analysis. And next slide, please. You can go into this tool and type in your zip code, and it will allow you to see the projections for the county that you live in. This is showing an example from Miami-Dade County, where you can see that if we don't take action on climate change, there would be, our projections forecast that there would be 166 days in an average year with a heat index above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. it's just a remarkable, remarkable number of days in those kinds of brutal conditions, and is a very, very large jump over the historical conditions. Obviously, Florida is accustomed to being hot, but that's really just a fundamental difference. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to take a moment and talk about what this would all mean then for Floridians. You know, we really have huge swaths of the year being spent in conditions that are dangerous to be outside. That would mean fundamental changes in day-to-day life. It would mean things like we couldn't have after-school sports as often because it would be dangerous. It would mean that it would be dangerous and difficult for outdoor workers to be performing their jobs. And it would also mean serious health risks for many different people, including the elderly, the very young who are unable to cool themselves as efficiently as adults are. Again, the people with pre-existing health conditions. I could go on. Extreme heat is rather insidious in how it affects many different parts of the population. And it would also have serious consequences for local economies. For example, as I mentioned, the consequences for outdoor workers, well, then that would really create problems for the agricultural sector, for tourism. If it's too hot for people to be outside, you know, places like Disneyland, for example, are going to have difficulty attracting people, and that's going to affect jobs and income. Next slide, please. So in addition to kind of going back to the resources that we developed at the Union of Concerned Scientists, we also developed a set of congressional district maps where you can go in and you can download information about how extreme heat is likely to change for the congressional district that you live in. And then you can take those resources and use them if you'd like to speak to your local decision makers about the kinds of changes that you would like to see. And so this is an example from Florida's 26th district where Miami is located. You can see historically the number of days with these kinds of extreme heat values and how, for example, those 105-degree days, you know, there would be a huge jump by late century if we don't take action compared to the historical values. But you can see on the right, it shows the column with the what would happen if we met the Paris Climate Agreement goal. And you can see that there's so much benefit. We would spare Floridians huge numbers of days with extreme heat if we could meet that agreement. Next slide, please. Oops. That's not supposed to be in there. Thanks. Next slide, please. So in addition to the map that we have available, we also have something called the heat widget, in which you can go in and type the county name that you live in and choose the temperature thresholds to explore. So you can also see it in that format as well. Next slide, please. So now going to what we've been doing and what you can do with these kinds of results, I wanted to talk about a piece of legislation that we have been advocating for at the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I should say that, you know, just to give a little bit of an example, we have been taking these congressional district fact sheets up to member offices in Capitol Hill. We went to about 20 or so member offices so far, and we really found that the members and their staff would look at these statistics for just the congressional district that they represent. And it was so powerful to them. And we heard that over and over and over. When you bring us the local, hyperlocal information, it makes a big difference because we can really see what the consequences of climate change are for us. So one of the things that we've been, as I mentioned, advocating for is a piece of legislation called the Ascencion Valdivia Heat, Illness, and Fatality Prevention Act. This bill is named after a farm worker who died of a heat stroke at the age of 53 after working a 10-hour shift picking grapes in California on a 100-degree or higher day. And he had requested healthcare and attention because he didn't feel well. His son ended up driving home. He was denied his request and he died on the way home. And what we know is that all of these kinds of heat-related deaths are preventable. If we take the right measures to protect people, if outdoor workers are not denied these kinds of, or are denied, sorry, let me say it differently. If they are not denied the request for medical attention and just humane breaks, we could spare these kinds of really tragic incidences. So we've been working with the National Heat Stress Coalition to drive support for this bill that would require the Occupational and Safety Hazard Administration, or OSHA, to implement mandatory required measures for employers to protect their employees in the face of extreme heat. Next slide, please. In addition to these sort of measures to protect people to the changes that are happening now, we also need to be advocating for changes that reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere right now. So we've also been working to advocate for policies and measures that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, everything from the federal level, things like staying in the Paris Climate Agreement, getting back in, working on the renewable electricity standard, trying to aim to get emissions down as fast as possible, ramping up electrifying sectors, ramping up renewable energy, all sorts of different measures, all hands on deck to create a safer future. Next slide, please. So how you can help, in terms of advocating for these kinds of things like the Ascencion Valdivia Heat Fatality and Illness and Prevention Act, or climate action, you can use the interactive tools that we provided to find the results where you live and download your congressional district fact sheet. Use them to meet with your different representatives, whether it be county officials, state legislators, or even your senators and representatives to Congress. You can share the report materials with your networks on social media. You can share it with your friends, other people whom you think might be interested, and really advocate for solutions. Next slide, please. So finally, the things that I'd like to leave you with is that failing to reduce emissions could really create a staggering expansion of extreme heat in the United States, and more so in Florida than really anywhere else. And if we take aggressive action on climate change, we can really contain that expansion and chart a much safer path forward for ourselves, for our kids, for our grandkids, and on and on. And really the time to act is right now. So with that, I will pass it back to Natalie, and thank you so much for your time.
All right, great. Dr. Lickler, thank you so much for that. We already have several questions about how can our attendees access your resources and the different tools, and we'll make sure to drop all of that in the chat box and Q&A boxes below. So before we move on to a call of action that we have for all of you today, I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on some solutions. So when we talk about climate and mitigating the impacts of the climate crisis, like extreme heat, something that has come up for me personally is that justice lens. And so people have maybe a hard time connecting the justice lens, especially if they haven't personally experienced. But I remember when I personally had that aha moment when I learned that the agency, the Federal Agency for Urban Development and Housing, doesn't require air conditioning in affordable public housing. I remember when I learned that, and you start connecting the dots on how things like your zip code and access to air conditioning affect your ability to scale the social ladder to get a good paying job or good education or good healthcare. So all of that is related. So advocating for accessible air conditioning in all public housing in the state of Florida is something that you can advocate for. Dr. Licker also mentioned pursuing 100% clean and renewable energy initiatives, for example, increasing our reliance on solar energy. In 2019, in the state of Florida, solar panel installers was the #1 fastest growing job in Florida. So when we advocate for clean energy, we're also advocating not only to decrease extreme heat impacts, but we're also advocating for a more robust economy. Dr. Licker, you talked about worker and labor protections and protecting people who work outside from excessive heat, whether they're indoor or outdoor workers. I think a lot of people can, when the information starts to surface about individuals like the farm worker who was denied shade and shelter and water, and who eventually died because of the extreme heat impacts. These kind of worker and labor protections go for all workers outside, including and foremost agricultural workers, but also paramedics, firefighters, architects, engineers, the patrols that help the little ones cross the street on their way to school. So this is kind of illuminates how it will affect us in our day-to-day life. And just to close a little bit on the solutions, people might have a hard time connecting the dots on what does tree canopy have to do with heat. But for example, if you do have a tree canopy, the shade that tree canopy provides can cool an area by up to 10 degrees. So in Miami, we are advocating for the County of Miami-Dade to increase its tree canopy to 30% on average, and prioritizing areas that have little tree canopy. Because if you connect the dots on climate and heat and tree canopy, you learn that if you have an area that is covered in pavement, that's really going to foster extreme heat, known as an urban heat island effect. Lastly, what we can do, well, one of the options, not lastly, there's lots of different avenues we can take to advocate, working with elected officials and zoning committees to establish urban agriculture gardens. So we know that extreme heat is going to impact our agriculture. We know that green spaces help dissipate extreme heat. So we know that climate crisis is a threat multiplier. I like to consider climate solutions a solutions multiplier. By having something like a food garden, not only are you disrupting that collected and exacerbated heat, but you're also helping to foster more of a local agriculture and food economy. So before I jump into the call to action, I just wanted to introduce people who are in Florida or who are in Miami-Dade to a tool that you can use to identify who your elected officials are and how to communicate with them. So if you simply enter your address in the Who is My Commissioner tab, you press the search bar, you'll get this great tool where you can identify your local elected officials, so you can target your communications with them, whether you're using the interactive heat map from UCS or you're writing a letter or making a phone call. I encourage people who are in Miami-Dade to use this tool, and if you're outside of Miami-Dade or even outside of Florida, consider locating a tool where you can identify your elected officials. And without further ado, we're going to conclude our webinar by introducing CLEO's biggest campaign that we've launched, which is the Florida Climate Crisis Campaign. We just launched this yesterday and we're really excited about it. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Natalia Ortiz. to talk a little bit about the Florida Climate Crisis Campaign.
Thank you so much, Nat and Dr. Licker. Great presentation. One quick thing also that I think doesn't get enough attention is just lowering our meat consumption. I think that's an easy one that we can all do. No one's saying we need to be the perfect vegan, but just simply taking steps like lowering your consumption of animal proteins to twice a week or once a week can make a huge difference. Remember that a huge reason for deforestation in the Amazon has to do with our consumption of beef. So that's a simple one we could all start with today. And the second one is to become more civically engaged, which takes us to the Florida Climate Crisis Campaign. And this webinar is brought to you as part of that campaign in partnership with the Valo Foundation, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and a partner that we have, Zuby Advertising. So what we want to do for the month of September is really raise awareness of the heat issue across our state. Most people don't understand what's happening. They just go outside and feel it's incredibly hot, but they don't realize how this is connected to absolutely everything that we care about. And so we've partnered with an artist to do these incredible statues. And I'm just going to share a video with you from our founder, Caroline Lewis, that can explain it perfectly.
The CLEO Institute is a creation of mine that is designed to educate the masses about the importance and urgency of the climate change that we're experiencing now. So the Melting Florida campaign is sort of a genius design where we use art to really communicate the science and the urgency of the climate crisis. What we're trying to do is to say to people, hey, it's reality, it's a crisis. Pay attention. This is you. This is what you are causing. This is what's happening to us.
And so we launched yesterday, super excited, at the Philip and Patricia Frost Museum of Science in Miami. This beautiful statue is outside. You can visit it whenever you'd like. Please practice social distancing and wear your mask. And it's going to reveal this message throughout the 5 days that it will be melting there, just showcasing how incredibly hot it is outside, that it can actually melt this thing. And we're also going to be featuring a very special statue in Tampa and another one in Orlando. And so our lifeguard house, and Nat, you can start the video, represents not just our quality of life, but also our tourism, because our tourism is directly tied to our economy. And so this is just a sneak peek of what happened yesterday. Miami Herald was there to cover it, as well as NBC6 and Channel 4 News. There was a wonderful press conference that we hosted yesterday with Congresswoman Donna Shalala and Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez. And what we're asking everybody to do is not just visit this beautiful statue if you have some time, but also, Nat, if you can change to the next statue. The next slide, sorry. Is help us out. We need your help. These statues are meant to help people understand what's happening. I want to learn more, and drive people to the Florida Climate Pledge or flclimatecrisis.org landing page. And I just put the landing page on the chat. Please sign the Florida Climate Pledge with us, whether you live in Florida or not, whether you care about our biodiversity, you vacation here, you know people here. We need your help. Florida is the most vulnerable state to climate change impacts, and we need our elected officials on both sides of the aisle to understand this is an urgent matter that needs bold climate policies. In addition to signing the Florida Climate Pledge, and visiting our beautiful statues, follow us on social media so that you can learn more about the events that we're going to be hosting the entire month of September to highlight the climate crisis. Tomorrow, there is a town hall with NBC6 that focuses on heat and the impacts that it has on our vulnerable communities. You know, a lot of people can't even afford right now to turn on their AC, for example. What does that mean? We are also doing a climate crisis webinar with Chief Meteorologist John Morales, explaining to us how this is impacting our extreme weather events, specifically hurricanes. And then last but not least, we're doing our last webinar, Surviving Florida Summers, Heat Stress on Our Outdoor Workers, to understand how this is impacting us, why this matters. And my goal for you today is to make the climate crisis a top concern for you for 2020, and to share this with your friends, with your family, with your colleagues. We have to start talking about this subject with each other, because this isn't something that should politically divide us. It's something that should truly unite us, because the climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. And it's up to our generation, not our children's, to take care of this issue now. By the time our kids are my age, it's gonna be too late, unfortunately. So it really is up to us, this generation, to do something about it. So I conclude with that. If anyone has any questions, please feel free.
Nati, thank you so much. All these different tools coming together, from the extreme heat tool to using art to advocate for climate. I continue seeing the innovation in the future, especially as our youth continue to lead this movement. So I think it's a great time to start some of our Q&A. Let me just go ahead and get to that slide. And we do have some questions, lots of people asking for the resources of the extreme heat map. And let me go ahead and open some of the other questions that you have. So we do have a question from Emma. I believe this is for you, Dr. Licker. Have you done any research on how extreme heat will affect wildlife in particular? Or Nati, do you have any insight on how extreme heat would affect wildlife in Florida?
I do, but I'll let Dr. Licker take that one first.
I believe you can.
Okay, all right, great. It said that I was not able to unmute myself. Okay, thank you. I personally have not conducted that kind of research. However, I have seen others who have that have conducted work on, for example, the effects on simply where wildlife are able to live, and the effect in terms of the range of animals. Climate change will make some places less hospitable for certain wildlife because it's going to change, for example, the vegetation that they may rely on. And so you might have certain wildlife coming in that can make use of the new vegetation, and other wildlife who can no longer thrive there. You see effects on the composition of wildlife and vegetation on nature preserves, and all sorts of different consequences of wildlife from the extreme weather events that we've been seeing. We see a lot of, for example, this is not necessarily pertinent for Florida, but the wildfires that we're seeing in the West in Australia. A big thing that we're seeing are the consequences for a lot of wildlife species, some of which are endangered or threatened. The koala bears in the Australian fires was a big one that captured a lot of media attention. And I think also it's important to note the consequences for marine species, because most of the heat that has been trapped because of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions has actually been absorbed by our oceans, and they've gotten significantly warmer. This has created really different conditions for animals in our oceans as well. So I could go on. It's not very specific to Florida because I'm not an expert on that, but those are some of the general topics that scientists are working on.
Yes, definitely. And specific here in Florida, and I don't know how many people participating are living in Miami-Dade, but we just experienced a dramatic fish kill in Biscayne Bay.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a combination of both the pollution that's entering the bay, in addition to the warming of the water, which Dr. Licker mentioned. The warmer the water gets, the less oxygen the water has. Algal blooms is a huge one that's particular to Florida that is also devastating our marine life. And again, it's just the perfect storm between the pollution that we're dumping into these waters, in addition to these warmer oceans. The Everglades is, incredibly vulnerable. What a special and incredible and unique habitat that the Everglades is. And we need to protect it. It's saltwater intrusion. I don't know if a lot of you are familiar with that, but as our ocean levels are rising, the salt water is coming from underneath us, because Florida is made of porous rock, and it's mixing a lot with the water, with fresh water, and our Everglades are incredibly vulnerable, which hosts just a slew of wildlife that is that's being impacted. Even our manatees, like the seagrass, they're experiencing impacts. So, it's particular to that wildlife question. In Tampa, actually, our statue is the Florida panther that will be melting. The lifeguard house in Miami, the Florida panther in Tampa, to represent our very incredible, vulnerable wildlife, both here in Florida and around the world. Yes, it's devastating what we're doing to them.
Yeah. Thank you, Nati. And the CLEO's executive director, Yoka, did drop some really interesting tidbits to elaborate a little bit more on the wildlife question. She talked talking about the Florida panther that is threatened habitat loss due to rising seas as a result of extreme heat and global warming, as well as in a broader context, how different animal species, their egg incubation, gender changes depending on heat. So something that's really on the forefront of that is turtles. And so a lot of different very fundamental factors on the line when it comes to extreme heat. I think what makes this conversation a little challenging is that there's a lot of indirect drivers and feedback loops that aren't super obvious when you look at them kind of from the surface view. We do have another question here for anyone who thinks, Nati, did you want to say something?
I did just want to throw one thing out there. A lot of people don't really think about national security as an issue when it comes to extreme heat, but it really is. Just think about those heat maps that Dr. Licker presented to us, and think about our soldiers. They're incredibly vulnerable to this. So it is a national security threat, to our country as well.
Yeah. And actually, to that point, my colleague Christy Dahl, who's actually the first author of the Killer Heat Report, worked with other colleagues at UCS to do an analysis of how the extreme heat projections that we looked at or talked about today are how they apply to military bases and some of the largest military bases across the country. So that's another resource that we could share as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for elaborating on that. So I have a couple more questions in here, and we'll make the most of the few minutes we have left. For anyone who would best be fit to answer this question, do you foresee a heavier reliance on technology and things like robots or maybe artificial intelligence when it comes to farming and construction sectors? That's one question. The second part is this something we should advocate for out of safety for our workers, and start rolling out programs to give workers other skills for safer jobs? Or would this just cause more of an economic crisis?
Great question. I'm happy to contribute a few thoughts. I'm certainly not an expert on on that particular topic. I do have expertise in agricultural sciences and know that there has been increasing automation on farming enterprises. But sort of how it's likely to change and expand because of the connection with climate, that I'm not sure about. But in terms of, this sort of question of, do we train people to have other jobs? I think that's also a question that we are having about the climate crisis in general, on every end in terms of the different transformations that it's going to require. I've even heard discussions about how do we create just workforce transitions for coal miners, for example, and people who are employed in the fossil fuel industry, to get them able to participate in renewable energy economies or other kinds of economies that can support climate action. In terms of exposing people to these conditions, I think we certainly, need to be taking aggressive action. There's so much more that we can be doing right now to protect workers. And I think that coupled with the need to really focus on climate action to not get to a situation in which people need to make those kinds of choices, I think is really important. But I think it's an important thing that we think about that humanitarian aspect that Natalie mentioned, that, this is really talking about the health and well-being of individual people. So we need to be acting with that reverence as we're thinking about the decisions that we're all making each day, and what our decision makers are doing, holding them accountable to that reality.
And to add to that, on the construction side, there is a lot of technology that is being developed to deal with construction, for everything in it, from smart glass all the way to cement, cement that's carbon neutral. So there is a lot of technology out there. Companies and industries are looking at what they can do. We're not in this alone. We just need to act much faster. And of course, the easiest way to get to that is through policy changes.
Thank you so much for that. Nati, where will the sculpture in Tampa be located?
At the University of South Florida, next to the Recreation and Wellness Center.
Great, thank you so much for that. And if you have
Launches on the 16th.
If you have any more questions about the Florida climate crisis campaign, please go ahead and check the website out that we dropped in the chat. All right, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Let's see here. Okay, so not directly related, but somehow indirectly as well. What is happening with the sewage infrastructure in South Florida and cyanobacteria? So I believe this question would be related to, heat playing a role in sea level rise and sea level rising impacting the septic tanks in South Florida. I hope I'm understanding that right. Did any of you want to elaborate on that? Nati, maybe you have some.
Yeah, so, our pipes are old. Our pipes are old. We are very vulnerable, of course, with sea level rise, and we have to do more. That's part of the problem with the fish kills is the amount of pollution that we're dumping into our ocean, into waters. With regards to solutions, what's happening with that, the city of Miami Mayor Francis Suarez is working diligently to try and see what the city can do. I'm not very familiar at a county level what Mayor Jimenez is doing. That may be something that Olivia can tackle. But the reality is that, it is up to our elected officials. We've known about this for a long time and just haven't done enough to do, to protect it. I always like to go back to something that Yoka mentioned is, our economy, nature is our economy, and our economy is directly tied to our nature. So, when people say, oh, that's too expensive, you end up paying for it in the long run, and you pay for it double and triple. So it just makes absolutely no sense at this point for elected officials to talk about, oh, that's too expensive, I can't fix that, or we can't do that. Because we know that at the end of the day, it has to get done, and if it doesn't, it comes out being much costlier, not just to our wallets, but devastating to our biodiversity.
Yeah. So Dr. Licker, did you want to add something? Sorry about that.
No, thank you.
At 12:59, we're right on time, and I just wanted to thank Dr. Licker first and foremost, and the Union of Concerned Scientists for partnering with us on this collaboration and really sharpening the conversation and giving us more tools to work with and to advocate for our health, for our biodiversity, for our city, our state. And if there's anything that you'd like to say before we close, you can go ahead and say it now.
Yes, please visit flclimatecrisis.org, also floridaclimatecrisis.org. Both websites go into the same landing page. Sign the Florida Climate Pledge. Hold our elected officials accountable. Talk to others about what's happening. If you're excited and motivated and energized, join the CLEO Institute speaker network and learn to become a climate speaker so you can educate others, whether it be your friends and family or place of worship. And when you follow us on social media, repost and reshare our climate crisis campaign with your friends and family, and always use the hashtag #FLClimateCrisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of the day and take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time.
Have a great rest of your day.